question, not everybody have been very highly supportive of the G20 itself, and the only country that really comes into mind is China. And so, Professor Swaran saying, you have done an extensive work on Indo-Chinese relations as well in the past and even to now. The Chinese President Xi Jinping has made it clear that he won't be participating in person like any other world leaders. And so this also begs the question, is, in a sense, China afraid of the growth of India? I mean, of course, it has had a number of territorial disputes between the two nations, but that's been going on for a very long time. And so what would your message be to somebody who's wondering that? Is China afraid of India's growth or India's new place in the global stage?
I think clearly, Stephen, there are multiple interpretations being given that at least to the minimum makes absence of Xi Jinping at G20 summit in New Delhi noticeable. The fact that there are analyses and speculations means that it matters. Now, whether it is the domestic preoccupation, whether it is the health, whether it is in any case Xi Jinping has not been traveling to too many countries, one could choose any of these explanations. But G20 fundamentally is a grouping of top 20 economies. And China being world's second largest economy, President Xi not joining the summit meeting draws attention. Now, one can understand that in terms of multiple explanations which are domestic but also international. One could look at the fact that India and China have had difficult relations for the last 3+ years. For 7 years, the United States has been at technology, trade, tariff wars with China. China has taken a certain position supporting Russia in Ukraine crisis. Those could be international explanation as to why those could be factors why President Xi perhaps thought it, wiser to not attend the summit meeting. But of course, China is participating. We all know that Prime Minister Li Qiang is leading the delegation to India, and China is not, in that sense, not present. And it is the country position that matters. Each country takes a position on certain issues that are for debate, where the attempt is being made to build consensus. Now, beyond international relations, if you look at the emerging global order, then there is one more explanation of absence of President Xi, because he was present at the BRICS summit meeting. So, is it that with the rising polarization of East and West, where President Xi had visited to Moscow, there are again likelihood of him visiting Moscow again, he visits BRICS summit meeting. BRICS summit meeting is able to demonstrate, showcase consensus and add 6 more members. And then he is not able to join G20, and we are discussing the complications in the final declaration, the way Sherpas are negotiating even now. So there are multiple ways to interpret as to why President Xi is not going to be in New Delhi. Let me make my second important point, which is to say, yes, summit meetings are very significant. Final declarations coming out of them are significant, but I agree with Dr. King, as he was saying, very often these are intentions that come out in final declarations. They are not concrete, actionable policy decisions. But even those are fantastic. But let us for a second look at the nature of the animal called G20. It's not a one flash in the pan summit meeting that takes place. As Kadambani was saying, there are 220 meetings organized in 60 cities of India. And therefore, multitude of meetings has happened so far. And remember, after summit meeting, India still had 81 days of presidency still left. So it's not end of the story. It's an ongoing process where India has been able to showcase culture, its developmental projects, its vision for future. to multitudes of people, and it's not that all meetings ended with no finalization of consensus. There were where consensus also existed. There are meetings where there are voluminous recommendations have come out. There are dozen plus what are called officially engaged groups, that they have dozens and dozens of working groups under them. This is unprecedented G20 18th like never before in the size of meetings and the size of voluminous recommendations that are already on the table, which has transformed how we look at G20. Third point, very quickly, is also to see how India has incorporated, shifted the focus, which is going to stay there for future as well, to bring in global south to the center stage of G20 discussions. And we are lucky that last year Indonesia, this year India, next year Brazil, in 2025 South Africa. One after another, it is the global south nations that are steering the trajectories of G20, where it is going. So in that sense, incorporation of global south and their concerns and their perspectives has also become clearly integral and is not going to disappear in any time soon. So some of the fundamental dent or imprint of India, if you allow me to say, is already there in G20, irrespective of what happens in the summit meeting. And then, of course, the fact that this is a group of so-called most powerful economies, India is seen as the most exciting economy. In last 5 years, moving from 10th to 5th position, next 5 to 7 years, all projections moving to third largest position, fastest growing economy, 7.2%. Next year, India's Reserve Bank of India says first quarter we are reaching 8.2%, compared to China's 5.2 claimed, 4% normal assessments. United States 1.8% growth rate. So there could not be a better country to be leading the presidency of G20 despite geopolitical crisis. Of course, there are geopolitical crises. Pandemic has created rattle, disjunctions of supply chains. There are a whole lot of shortages and price hikes of fuel, food, fertilizer, finance, and so on. But India could not have been the presidency which is so deserving to be leading the G20. India could not have made more change in the fundamentals by shifting it to global south. And my last point in 10 seconds, India might end up turning G20 into 21. That will be the structural change with African Union joining G20. So the India imprint is already there on G20. It can expand further in coming days. That is the hope. But otherwise, I think India has showcased the fundamental contribution it has made to G20 already, hoping more change will happen in coming weeks.
Thank you. And if my memory serves correctly, Prime Minister Modi, during his joint address to U.S. Congress, has mentioned the importance of African Union's participation in G20 as well. So thank you so much for that, Professor. That leads us to our next point. Professor Swaran saying, there's also, going back to the territorial disputes, it seems like India isn't just having problems with issues with China, of course, but one of the complaints that we've seen was from the neighbor Pakistan, where one of their complaints against G20 was that the session was held in Jammu and Kashmir, and Pakistan has claimed that it is a quote unquote a disputed land, and it is therefore inappropriate for India to hold any type of international gathering there. But it seems like the world, not only India but the world in a sense, is disagreeing with that regard. And I was wondering if you can maybe touch upon that point and how this is what this means for the future, for at least the stability in a part of India that we haven't really seen before and for quite a while, ever since Article 370. Sorry, yeah, should mention that.
I'm happy, Stephen, that you mentioned that the world doesn't agree with Pakistan. Had I said that, it might appear like being jingoistic about it. Incidentally, Pakistan is not and is not likely to be in G20 in an India future. But let me add, it's not just the Union Territory of Jammu and Kashmir, but also events happening in Arunachal Pradesh. Yes, China is the country that has had issues with these meetings, but it's not that India chose these areas specifically. Let me underline that 60 cities that I mentioned where multiple repeated meetings have taken place have been based on ensuring that every province and every union territory of the Republic of India has some event to host. So it's not that India deliberately chose Union Territory of Jammu and Kashmir. India chose all union territories and all provinces, just like all districts of India have contributed to the gifts that are being given to the delegates who are coming to the G20. So the effort has been really to engage India into the G20, engage the global community to know India, how diverse and how versatile India is. So in that sense, I don't think the intention from Indian side was to, indicate something to Pakistan or indicate something to China by hosting some of these meetings in Arunachal Pradesh or in Jammu and Kashmir. That's point number one. Second, I think what is equally interesting is that in most multilateral meetings, it is a commonplace knowledge that bilateral issues are not to be brought in for any discussion and they should not ideally matter. So China and India sit in so many other multilateral meetings, and it's not that bilateral issues. We just had, just 2 weeks back, a meeting in Johannesburg. India and China also had border tensions when they met in Johannesburg. But in Johannesburg, none of these tensions were able to impact on what happened in terms of how parleys happened and how outcomes were brought about. So it's understood that in multilateral meetings, bilateral issues ideally should not matter. But of course, countries choose to take those issues as reasons to react the way they do. And I think that's not, again, a reflection of a mature and ideal behavior in playing a responsible partner and player and member of important multilateral forums at global level. And that is something that the whole world can witness in that sense, whether we are holding multilateral important meetings hostage to your bilateral concerns or whims and fancies, if you like to call it. So that's a second point that I think that is, again, something that world is witnessing and how India is responding and how some of the other countries are responding to those issues. And finally, of course, to make trivial issues significant. Now, for example, mentioning that certain expression, because it is in a language which is not one of the languages of United Nations, should be removed. Whereas that expression is very central to India's civilizational ethos. And therefore, or try to compare it with inclusion of that expression with Belt and Road Initiative, look like a typical exercise world has seen China doing in terms of hiding behind procedural matters to block major decisions. Very often in United Nations, we see when certain people have to be designated as terrorists, then of course procedural matters are brought in to delay the decisions and ultimately block those decisions. But that's not something that know. That's not something that India doesn't know. India understands that this is how countries behave. And the most recent comment that I was reading from India's foreign minister is to say Russia has a sovereign right as a member to G20 to demand something as to how Ukraine crisis should be described in any joint declaration that happens. So India respects that sovereignty or freedom of every sovereign country to bring in the issues that they want to bring into the table, address issues the way they want to address it, but it is for the world to judge as to how each country is behaving, whether we are playing a constructive role. You heard that Jake Sullivan, of all people, advising China to play a constructive role and not play a role of a spoiler. So India doesn't have to say things. I'm sure there are other countries that are clearly making much more clearer, if you allow me, sharper commentaries on how other nations are behaving in a situation like this. India has always kept, its options open. So you can notice that despite tensions going on the border for 3 years, India's bilateral trade is now, I think, standing about $128 billion for this year. So in that sense, it's not that India has blocked relationship with any country, including Pakistan. I mean, India works with Pakistan to supply humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan, despite the standard policy that terror and talk will not go together. So in that sense, a flexible, maneuverable approach to foreign policy is something that India follows. It leads to a certain amount of success in building consensus, and sometimes it doesn't lead to sort of desirable levels of consensus building. I think India is still making effort as we speak on this program that certain ways on certain issues consensus can be built. I had last heard and read in public platforms in reports saying in various meetings that have happened so far, somebody had counted 59 themes on which consensus had already been built. Now we don't know how many of these themes will appear if there is a final declaration, or how those lower level consensus will be reflected at the senior level meeting of national leaders. But that is something that the world these days can easily see through. And India's effort is not just to have win any brownie points in the sense of showcasing that India is a host and therefore India can push some things the way it wants. The focus here has simply been to highlight issues that India thinks are important, primarily from southern global south perspective. So you look at issues that India is raising. India is talking of climate finance. India is talking of traditional medicine. India is talking of debt crisis. India is talking of healthcare. India is talking of agriculture. India is talking of digital platforms. Issues that are seen as important to India, along with, of course, Ukraine crisis, are reflection of what in India's vision are important areas where consensus needs to be built and some decisions need to be made. Now, India is only one of the 20 and potentially perhaps 21 members, and that explains why India will push to some extent, and then, of course, will accept the outcome that happens at end of the summit meeting. But let's hope that there are 81 more days, as I said, beyond the summit meeting. So it's an ongoing process, and we might see some more things happening before India demits the presidency and Brazil takes over from there.
Thank you so much, Professor Swaran Singh. That leading Professor Swaran Singh.
Thank you, Stephen. Clearly, absence of President Putin and President Xi Jinping, for very understandable reasons, but has clearly triggered more suspicions of the widening polarization of potentially another East and West getting into difficult equation with each other. And I think that is something we have to take note of. But on the positive side, the North and South divide seems to be bridging faster than ever. No longer now the global South has any pejorative pretenses that it had in 1950s. Increasingly, it was beginning to be seen as nomenclature for solidarity of global South. And now apparently the global South has become at the center stage of the G20 people. G20 parlays also till recently was largely a collation of, famous economists and policy wonks and some politicians in closed door meetings. India has really brought it out to the people. People who used to protest outside are now sitting inside the table, sitting on the table, making discussions. So from a closed door, high-powered meeting, it has now turned into what I was just mentioning, somebody saying people's festival, and that is a transformation which is a hope for future, because the globalization that had occurred so far, which was largely industrialization, urbanization, profit-driven, market-driven, is now being gradually transformed from growth rates to development being the focus. And I think Indian Foreign Minister is now calling it as re-globalization. And that kind of transformation in the vision, in the processes, in structures of G20, I think, is bridging the gap between North and South for sure. And I think that definitely is a positive sign. How quickly things will move forward in terms of implementation, in terms of building consensus, will remain a matter of speculation for a long time. We'll have to see until this summit meeting finally comes to an end this weekend as to what have they decided to do. But I suppose some of the fundamentals have already changed, and that is a positive sign. Geopolitics is drifting in negative direction. Geoeconomics is drifting in a very positive direction. That's how the picture looks to me right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Singh.